Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to a new video. I am Marcus Hyatt, your host, if you will, for these videos, or instructor, whatever you want to call it. Today's video is going to be a continuation of the previous video I put up, which was session organization in Pro Tools. And we're going to be doing the same thing today, except we're going to be using Persona Studio One. Now, I mentioned in the last video that Studio One was a software that I prefer to use primarily if I have the option to do so, and that's strictly just because of the purposes of how good the workflow is for me, how customizable it is. I can really get in there and do things exactly the way I want to do them and set the software up to work that way, as opposed to having to adjust to what already exists as the workflow process within it. One of the biggest things that Studio One offers that I really like is the ability to customize my key commands. I like it better. That's all my personal preference. It's got nothing to do with how anything sounds. It's got nothing to do with pricing or anything like that. It's literally just, I believe that the workflow is better for me because of the fact that I can customize it. I can even get down to customizing the color of the screen so that my eyes are more pleased with what I'm looking at, and one day I might work on it and it's a black GUI, whereas the next day it's a white GUI. So again, the customization is really big for me. And it's just as powerful, you know, it's just as powerful while being what I feel is a little bit more intuitive to learn as far as the advanced settings and setting up preferences and stuff like that. So anyways, I won't get into a Studio One endorsement per se on here, but just to give you guys some options, you know, I would suggest never to just go into something because it's what everybody else is doing. You know, don't be afraid to not follow the trend. Find what works for you. Pro Tools is obviously the industry standard and it works great, but there's nothing wrong with trying out Studio One or even a Logic or even a Digital Performer if that works better for you, or whatever out there exists that helps you to be more efficient and have a better workflow. That way you are more, again, efficient, and also people will want to call you more because they know that you're going to get your work done. And at the end of the day, any legit producer, artist, A&R that's contacting an engineer doesn't care what they're working on, for the most part, as long as they know they can get the product that they want. Okay? So I've got this session open. This was a session, the song was called Cali Forever by an artist named 7098. Most of you guys who are watching these videos, the first few people that see the videos probably know who he is. For those of you who see this later, he was the artist that was playing in the last video, and I'll even tag another one actually this song in here. This song is actually out on iTunes and Spotify and Google Play and all that. It's called Cali. I believe it's just called Cali is what's actually on there, but I'll throw some links in there for that. So again, this is just to discuss some organization, and again, we'll cover the same concepts, and I'll go quickly through the first few things that we talked about in the last video because they're pretty much identical. And the first thing we talked about was color coding, right? So this session is slightly different from the one I talked about in the Pro Tools video, being that this is a more electronic session. And what I mean by that is there's not a lot of live instrumentation. There's going to be a lot of elements in the mix that, if you were working on a live song, would probably be in tracks because it's samples and program strings and stuff like that. And so it might be, you might want to confuse, or you might confuse with what kind of colors you should use for that, or you might end up, if you'll notice in the last session, I had this light blue section, which is like my keys or my ancillary stuff, and I had two tracks in there, which was just a piano and a B3, whereas here I've got these two different pianos, some strings which are slightly different, some Rhodes which could be slightly different, some sample hits, and you know, that's fine. Again, as long as you understand that they are like instruments, and like instruments doesn't necessarily have to be based off of some preconceived notion of what a like instrument is. It could be like in how you view them. Okay, so for example, and I'll skip down to this and work my way back up. Sample hits, Rhodes, aux keys, strings, all that stuff, you know, they may not be literal keyed instruments, like the sample hit and this sample here, and this would actually be a light blue. There's nothing about these that is significantly different of these other things inside this group, aside from the fact that these are actually keyed instruments, right, in the keys bus or ancillary bus, and the sample is not necessarily a keyed instrument, but it's still holding a melody or a riff in the song as far as keeping the progression going. So that's how I view that. Now, you might have some people who would say, let me take my samples and make them their own group and call them a different color and run them through a different bus or whatever the case is. And I might do that if I've got a huge session where I've got tons of synthesizers and tons of keys. I might say, you know what, let me just separate those and then get some area of some samples or some, what I know is recorded tracks, like this string track was played off of a keyboard or a synthesizer as opposed to an actual string quartet. But again, it's all preference. And at the end of the day, like I said in the last video, as long as you are consistent across most of your, or not even most, as long as you are consistent across all your sessions, then it shouldn't really matter how you exactly decide to do it, because however you decide to do it, you'll know what that is. It's just practice. It's good practice, repetition, and it sticks in your head. Down below, here's something new. We've got some brass in this song, which is just some crescendoed trombones, I believe. And you'll see that I've got these a color, somewhat of a, I could really jump between these two because that makes more sense right there. A yellow goldish color, because obviously most brass instruments are gold or yellow. So that's pretty simple for me to know where those are. And again, I've added a new bus, which I now call a brass bus. And I've still got my guitars, which are green. I've still got my bass, which is purple. And I've still got all of my percussion or drums, which are blue. I didn't have much percussion, if you will, in this session, nor the last session. And what I mean by percussion, obviously this is all percussion, but I mean aside from like a drum kit and then some congas, woodblock hits, triangles, that whole thing. If I had more of those, I might color those a darker shade of blue, just to kind of like maybe like that, just to separate them away from the drums. But for the time being, that works. So again, color coding is huge. In this particular session, what I wanted to really delve into color coding wise was just seeing, there's a lot more vocals in this session as far as backgrounds and harmonies and doubles. And most of these are going to be the same as what I had talked about. As you can see, my lead vocal is still mainly orange, except for this green track in here. And you'll see the title of that says Clean Punches. And basically we went back and we recorded punch-ins for a clean version, which we felt was better than just cutting out those sections of the song, because there might be whole phrases or words that just sound kind of funny, or the track just kind of seems like it stops for a moment because all the words quit. So we went back, put some clean punches, and I want to make sure I can clearly identify those, so I throw those in there as green. Again, my concept of the color green, whether it's light green, is that similar to my guitars that are light green, it's all clean sounding, right? So this is more referencing a clean tone, whereas this is referencing literally clean lyrics, right? So then farther down, now we're seeing a lot more background vocals and harmonies and stuff like that, which we didn't see in the other session. So the one thing about Studio One where I have to give Pro Tools the edge is that the Pro Tools color palette is a little bit nicer to me. You've got some more options and some saturation things, so you can really get in there and get some real neat colors, where Studio One, they all kind of seem like, even the ones that are right next to each other, seem like they're relatively close. And I feel like I run out of colors very quickly, because I do try to avoid these nasty brown looking and purple looking ones. But either way, so whereas in Pro Tools, doubles and anything like that, I might use a dark orange along with it. There's not really a solid dark orange color on Studio One. So in that case, I just use a yellow, and it's slightly, again, off from the orange. It's relatively close, so I know they're somewhat similar but not the same, being that these are lead vocals and these are doubles. And then as I get down to harmonies, I want to jump into completely different colors, because I want to make sure I understand that these are doing some kind of harmonic element that is creating a certain feel or tone in the song. And I want to be able to find those quickly, because a lot of times when I'm navigating a session, I'll be playing my session and I will hear something like that and say, oh, maybe the blend's not right, or maybe there's a tuning issue and I have to figure out where that is. And it's very quickly for me to say, okay, there is a discrepancy between harmonies and lead, or maybe two harmonies. And I can quickly jump down, and if I, this is again, not a super large session, but if I had a very big session, huge pop session with tons of background vocals, I might even go in and change the colors of certain harmonies. All my hook harmonies are going to be one color, all my verse harmonies are going to be another color, so I can quickly identify. Again, whatever works for you to quickly navigate. So color coding, pretty straightforward. The naming concept is still the same in both. The naming concept is the same in any program you use. Color coding might differ a little bit just depending on how their color schemes work and what the options are. But naming is naming. And notice I've got everything named here exactly what it is. Main verse 1, verse 2, clean punches with the vocals. AA is literally an ad lib where he says AA, right? Pretty straightforward. Hook doubles, hook lick, gas slash views is just a double of the word gas here and then views here based on what he says in the hook. So again, really getting in and naming everything perfectly. And I mentioned in the last video that the biggest thing for the reason for doing that is so that you can quickly and efficiently navigate your own session, and that is still the case. But another thing is when you are moving sessions between studios or sending sessions to other people, like for example, if I was not the final mix engineer on this, or maybe I recorded the song as well, so maybe I wasn't going to mix it at all, maybe I'm just doing the recording. When I export my stems, or even if someone else is using Studio One and I can just send them the session file, when they populate it, they're going to see all these names for exactly what they are. And that saves them from saying, oh my gosh, what is this track.01 or audio 1.2, whatever it is, like that's hard to look at. And we do want to definitely avoid doing that. Okay, so again, color coding and naming is pretty standard across the board in every DAW. Now, one thing where Studio One gets slightly different from Pro Tools is the marker situation. So you'll see up here, I've still got a marker and a marker timeline. Now, let me close this arranger for the time being so we can just see the markers, and that's what they look like, okay? And it's very simple compared to Pro Tools. I've got a start marker, which always exists in my session as where the start of the song is, and that start, and I've also got an end marker in every session to dictate where the end of it is. Now, those are always in the session, and they always dictate my bouncing range when I'm exporting a file. So if I go to song, export mixdown, I can choose between song start and end marker. Now I have some other options, but we won't get into that too much. But for the purposes that I use the start and end marker, it is so that that's my export range. Okay, similar to the drag and select in Pro Tools. Now after that, I can start adding in markers. So I have, after my start and end marker, I have these other markers I can place. Now in Pro Tools, to put a marker, the key command was the number pad enter, or you can manually come over to the marker timeline, similar to how you can do in Studio One, and hit insert a marker to place one, okay? Now notice in Studio One, it just places a marker with a number versus prompting you for the marker name, okay? Now, once you do that, you can hit that, you could double click, and you could change your marker name, okay? Now, obviously, there is a lot less options here versus in Pro Tools where you had a marker number option, then you had a plethora of options below of how that marker could operate. In Studio One, you can just change the name of the marker. Now, Studio One operates much more straightforward and much more, hey, this seems like what's going on, right? So my start marker is technically marker number 1, and then in order of how they exist, it counts 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth, okay? For key commands, if you hit insert with the generic Studio One key commands, hitting insert will do the same as creating a marker with a number depending on where it is in the timeline. If you hit shift enter, then it will create a marker number, or it will create a marker, but it will ask you for the name first of what you want to name that, and you can call that marker whatever. Now, I've changed my key commands up, like I was saying earlier. I've got the ability to do that in Studio One to where I wanted to use my shift insert for something else, so I just made my insert button be insert named marker, because very rarely, if ever, will I insert a marker without naming it, okay? So those are quick ways to get those in there. Now, with that being said, again, I mentioned that when I added a marker here, it made it number 3 because it was number 3 in the timeline. That is a big fundamental difference between markers in Studio One and in Pro Tools, is that Pro Tools will create a marker and number it based on when you created it in reference to other markers. So if it was my 5th marker, it is marker number 5, no matter where I put it. Whereas in Studio One, it will dictate what the marker is based on where it is in the timeline. So again, I showed a moment ago, if I create this here, I've got number 3 because it's the 3rd marker in line, with start being my 1, verse 1 being my 2, and then I have 3, versus if I create it after my chorus, I now have marker number 4, okay? And that is also the reason that's important is that that is how your key commands will work. Now, in the generic Studio One key commands, the start marker is the one numpad key, okay, and then your end marker would be the two numpad key. Now, I personally don't care for that. I thought it made more sense for me to change my key command so that my 0 on my numpad is marker 1. And then after that, depending on what order they're in, I just hit the number pads up through the number 9. So verse 1 is marker number 1, so I hit 1. And then if I hit 2, I go to my next one, 3, 4, 5. And then my end marker is now the last one, which is technically marker number 6. So it ends up as number 6. Now, if I add a marker in here, and I've got marker 3, and I always want to make a habit of organizing and naming myself. So let's just say this is, we'll call it verse 1, and we'll say maybe we did a punch here, right? Just keeping some kind of naming system for why I might put a marker. So now that changes. The 0 becomes the start, which is still what it is. 1 becomes verse 1, but whereas 2 originally went to chorus, 2 will now jump to verse 1 punch because that's the next marker in line. So with Studio One, you are literally going to be looking at which marker number is this on the timeline, what in the order in which they're showing, and that's the button I want to press in order to get to what I'm looking for, okay? So pretty simple with markers. Now, so in Pro Tools, we had some marker colors between each marker, so you were quickly able to see where a marker started and stopped. Studio One, you're not able to change the marker color, although I believe that's kind of annoying, but maybe I'm crazy. You can only change the name. So another thing that they offer on here, and this is not the purpose for why it exists, but it's the purpose for how I use it, and you can use it for both ways, is what we call the arranger track, okay? Now, what the arranger track does is you can set a range, and you can call that range whatever it is, right? So for example, I set a range here as the intro to my song. I've got a range here as my verse 1, a range here as my chorus 1, verse 2, chorus 2, outro, okay? What that does is it assigns every file or event underneath that range to the range itself, okay? What does that mean? Well, if I wanted to fly chorus 1 over to chorus 2, right? Or let me say I wanted to fly chorus 1 back after the outro. I want to end with a chorus. I could very quickly hold down Option, or on a Mac, Option, on a PC, Alt, and I can hit that chorus 1 and I can drag that over to here, and it will move all of what was underneath chorus 1 exactly over here. And now I've got that chorus again repeated. Now again, you have to be careful because you might have a little piece here. For example, at the end of my chorus 1, my strings kind of fade off a little bit. It might have some reverb dying out, and it literally just copies the square, so I have to come make that adjustment. But I don't use this that much, but for those of you who are getting into producing, especially the hip hop music or electronic music, and you know you've got set start and end points at your downbeats and whatnot, you can very quickly arrange your song like this, create a section, drag it over, and do whatever you need to do to it. Again, I don't use it for that purpose. I use it for the purpose of having colored markers, okay? So realistically, sometimes I won't even have a marker track popped open. And I can close that, and I've got what are, in theory, working as Pro Tools markers. Okay, and I've got the name of what the section is. I've got a different color for it. Now these colors I can actually customize, whereas on Pro Tools markers you can't customize those colors. And that's pretty much the gist of how I use these. I don't use it for the arranger purposes too much. It's neat if I need it, but that's the purpose of that. And to add any other sections, I can just double click. It'll try and populate what it thinks might exist already, and I can go in here, change the name of that, and I can call it right click and name and call it whatever I want. Let's say the vamp. One thing I want to point out, to be very careful with you guys who want to use this arranger track, you'll notice that when I originally created it, let me do it again so you can see. If I double click here and I drag this out, okay, well right now there's nothing, you know, I need to fill this space in, okay? I want to be careful not to click and drag, because notice how it highlights everything beneath it, meaning that if I were to do that same thing on accident, let's say here, and this is going to be my new outro, let's say you see it right there. If I try to drag it over, everything underneath it is already connected. So I want to be careful that I always do the click and extend option. If you can see my mouse changing to this drag option, because the drag option lets you adjust the range without affecting what's beneath it, versus if you just grab it and move it, it's going to take everything with it. So some things to be aware of with using that if you use that. Sometimes I operate with just the arranger track. Sometimes I'll operate with both open. It just, whatever's easier for you to see to be able to do your work. Tempo, again, in Studio One, similar to Pro Tools, we want to make sure we set our tempo ahead of time before we start recording. The biggest reason for that, especially in Studio One, and I cannot say for fact that I know how Pro Tools does this, if it does it, but Studio One has an option, and I want to say it defaults to where when you load in a file to Studio One that has any sort of file tempo saved with it, meaning it was recorded with this tempo, then Studio One will automatically time stretch it to fit the tempo of your Studio One session. For example, if I import a file, or if I record a file, let's say these vocals down here we did, the session tempo is 83, so the file tempo of this vocal is 83. Therefore, if I change my session tempo to 100, it's going to move or squeeze down my vocal track in order to fit it into that 83 BPM file, fit it into that 100 file, and it will keep the same speed, not the same speed, it will speed it up to keep the same tempo that the session is now operating at. So my vocal will now become faster. But notice these other instruments up here that I didn't record in this session specifically, well, these don't have file tempos. Nothing is set. So similar to how Pro Tools might operate, I can change the session tempo and these files are just going to play at the same speed they were playing before. And you'll notice you can see how my arranger is no longer lined up because I've sped up my session. So all my arrangement stuff moves faster because it follows the tempo of the session, but these files with no file tempo will not follow. Again, you can go in there and manually change file tempos. I could set this to 83 and it would adjust itself to now fit into my new deal, but that's too much work in hindsight to try and go through and fix all that stuff, versus if you set your tempo of what the song is supposed to be before you import your files and before you record, you will not even rarely, you will not run into this problem. But a lot of times people will throw these files in and start recording and then try and fix the tempo afterwards. And you, especially in Studio One, you run into the issues of the session trying to time stretch stuff for you, and suddenly things are not lining up the way that they're supposed to. And it's very, very annoying to try and go back and fix. For those of you who don't know, your tempo selection for Studio One is down here in the bottom as opposed to up top where it was in Pro Tools, and you can double click that and type in whatever. You can also click and drag if you just want to, if you'd rather click and drag. For those of you who do that, you can get into the decimal points if you need to, same way you can in Pro Tools. You can access the tempo timeline or the tempo track up here by hitting this, and you can change that number up here, and this is also where you would add in other tempo points to make any sort of tempo changes throughout your track. Okay, so again, tempo is really important. Let's make sure we get into the habit of creating that in our session at the beginning before we get into anything else. With that being said, that is again the gist of the simple or the basic organization. This is basic organization for Studio One. Color coding, naming, markers, and tempo. That's really the big thing to get going and make sure that you can quickly navigate your session and you don't run into any kind of funny problems. So again, thank you guys for checking this video out. I hope this is helpful to somebody. Please, 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 please leave comments or send me email or something, or even if you have me on Twitter or Instagram, shoot me DMs or something to let me know what you guys would like me to do a topic on and discuss. And that way, again, like I say in every video, we can all help each other grow and become better at what it is we want to do. Again, please subscribe, share this with your other engineer friends, or even those of you who, or those who aren't engineers yet and are interested in learning this stuff. Please share it with them. Again, we want to do whatever we can to get this channel to everybody so that they can learn and ask questions about what they want to learn and get those answers sooner than later. And yeah, so again, thank you guys for checking this out. Again, please leave suggestions, please leave critiques, all of that, and I will see you guys with the next video. Thank you.
see them in the rear. I'm lapping them, plotted out and attacking it. They need doctors, they slacking. I did a lot where I'm at, but they don't see it. Guess they Stevie, but that's cool with me. Ain't much they could do with me. Yeah, they shade the only time I ever see a cool degree. I'm heating up forever. 98 go crazy, baby. You won't find nobody better. And every time he come in with the vibes the city needin', I'm in Hollywood. I'm Hollywood. Don't FaceTime me or text me.
Stay in Cali forever.
Ay, ay, I might just stay in Cali forever. Might just stay